and thank you for your cooperation. We believe this will enable everyone to get the most possible out of each presentation. And our presenter tonight is Dr. Stephen Gaisyor. Stephen?
Cool, thank you. Thank you all for coming. Tonight is a discussion that is in many ways near and dear to my heart. I am actually a PhD in molecular genetics and cell biology and have been a college biology instructor for the past 8 years. And so one of the current cultural challenges to a nice biological understanding of evolution, of biology, things that are very pertinent to the way we think about our place here and what to do for the future, really comes down to having a nice sound basis for understanding biology and biological processes. And one of the challenges to biology is this conflict between religion and biology. And while some people take the stand, very famous people like Richard Dawkins or Sam Harris or Christopher Hitchens, to be strict atheists, I am not in any way trying to have this discussion be a put down on whether one should or should not hold moral beliefs or have religious tendencies or beliefs, but there's this conversation that tends to come to loggerheads when it comes to understanding evolution. And so what I hope to do, these are two conversations and arguments that, as far as I know, are novel. I've come up with them myself, and as ways to address certain points of contention within the way those two sides debate the conversation. So it's actually a two-part talk. There's this thing called irreducible complexity, and I hope to talk about that in a way that helps people understand biology a little bit better. And then the second one is the biological basis for morality, because one of the big things that comes up, and you'll see Sam Harris talk about this, that frequently when people say, well, if we believe in Darwin and evolution, then and you say there's no basis for religion, then what is our basis for morality? And so people use the argument that we need morality, and thus we need religion to be a basis for morality within our current culture. And I'm going to say that I think that there is an alternate way of viewing that. So I will take questions in between the two segments. Although if you have anything that is a particular point of confusion as I'm going through the analogy, then please hit the keyboard and type your question in local chat. And if it's something that I think I can quickly address, I will do so. So yeah, so my alter ego here in Second Life is Stephen Zootfly. And one of the things that I do is head up a education biology activity development group called Virtual Islands for Better Education. All right, so one of the long-held beliefs and tenets in how religion attempts to explain evolution and biology comes from a theologist named William Paley, and he wrote a book in 1802 called Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity. And he put forth a very specific analogy, although this concept and idea had been around and had existed before. But the idea is, if you were walking along the beach and then you came across a watch and you looked at it, you'd say, wow, this clearly is very complex. This clearly has parts that go together in very particular ways for very particular purposes. And so the only conclusion is that it had to have been designed and constructed. And thus the only possible conclusion after that is that there must have been a creator to have made the watch. And I have two lines of arguments for why we should not believe this as the only and sound explanation from a biological perspective. But I'll come back to that in just a little bit, because while this is predating Darwin, right? This predates Darwin and Origin of Species by 40-some years, that it's the modern version of this that people are very familiar with and has been actively voiced in the current conversation. And this is this idea of irreducible complexity. That again, if you were to think about that watch, or again, if you think about any sort of constructed machinery, like the Mousetrap game. So who here has played Mousetrap? It's a fun game by Milton Bradley, currently owned by Hasbro. And it's this fun game where at the end, what you want to do is trap the mouse underneath that red net. And the way it actually works is you start a ball rolling, and then through hitting intermediate machines, it ultimately brings down that net onto the mouse, hopefully. Again, what happens in the game frequently is that if you have any slight piece misaligned, like that stupid diver who's got to go into the bowl, if you have him misaligned, then it doesn't work, even though you start the ball out. So again, someone in local chat mentioned this. This is an example of a Rube Goldberg type of device. And I have a link to the Wikipedia page for the Rube Goldberg. But the idea here is the fact that if there's any part that's missing from this pre-constructed machinery, and then you take one of those parts away, it's irreducibly complex. You can't break it down into parts and have it still work. And so this is very similar to the watch analogy. This has, again, a very similar vein of thought to looking at something that's designed, has lots of moving parts that need to work together. If they don't, then it doesn't work. And this was a book published in, I forgot to look up the date, called Darwin's Black Box. Again, this is some unexplained part of Darwin's theory, and it was written by Michael Behe, who is actually a biochemist at Lehigh University. And he gave 9 examples of, and coined this term in terms of applying it to biology, of irreducibly complex to biological systems. What you see there on the left is the flagellum, or a schematic of a flagellum, which is this part in cells that whips a tail around and does various things. It either moves an organism, or the related structure, the cilia, are in your throat, so that when you get a lot of mucus, it moves the mucus up towards the mouth so it doesn't get into your lungs as much, helps remove it. And the idea here is that this is a molecular motor. And so this molecular motor has to have all of its working parts working. And if there's anything that is in essence missing from it, then what will happen is the flagellum and this molecular motor will not work. Now the picture there on the right is an example of clotting. And so one thing we know about the clotting pathway, again, you get a flesh wound, or you get some sort of puncture into your bloodstream through a vessel, and there's a slow cascade of proteins and other soluble molecules that need to come together to create clotting. Now, there's examples in, like if you've heard of the disease hemophilia, there are individuals who are missing one of the factors and are unable to clot their blood. And in fact, without care or medical intervention, they tend to die at a young age because of bleeding problems. And so if you take a factor away from this, again, that's the way he argued it, then it doesn't work. And so how is it possible for evolution to create irreducibly complex systems or motors? Because if they only work together, then how could you have something before that? And so again, this is a slightly more complicated, slightly more subtle argument of they must have been designed for them to work the way they are. Now, the standard refutation to the molecular motors concept is something that if you've watched any number of Kenneth Miller videos, and there's some links in the supplementary information where he refutes certain ideas of intelligent design. And he's very eloquent. He does a very good job of debating certain ways from a biological perspective, and I'm not in any way going to try and trump what he's able to do. But what you see here in this particular image, again, here is the flagellum on the left. And what you have on the right is another known molecular motor called ATP synthase. And in fact, what scientists and evolutionary biologists have done over time is demonstrated that the core motor of the flagellum is derived from the motor of ATP synthase. And so this fits the Darwinian paradigm very nicely, that what you have is some sort of pre-constructed part, and then through addition, modification, adaptation, it can actually take on another role. And so, again, we don't, as far as I know, the scientific community has not broken down every single step and every single gene and component to show how they one evolved from the other. And in fact, there may have been separate ways that evolved in different organisms. But in essence, this irreducibly complex machine, you can see how it's actually built upon some prior structure. And so it's in fact not technically irreducibly complex in the context of evolution. And there are lots of examples. This is also true for the Claudian pathway, that in fact Kenneth Miller talks about how if you look at other species that have Claudian pathways, you actually can see examples where they're missing one or two of the factors, and in fact it seems to work just fine. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this one because this is the standard argument. Again, I want to present some of my relatively novel points of view on this one, but this is a very compelling argument. And yet, I feel like, you know, in many ways, it misses one of the main points, and I don't see people really always hammering home, is that if you're someone who's looked at and discovered a watch on the beach, can anybody guess what main part is missing compared to looking at, say, if you found a snail, or if you found the fossil of a fossilized worm, or some other sort of creature that you were to see on there? I mean, right, they all have motors, they all have working parts. What is the main part that watches would be missing? Yeah, so Jen Mark points out that, again, any sort of creature you wouldn't necessarily see it was designed for any particular person or purpose. But I think it's more simple than that. Again, you just look at the two. You can compare the two. Well, again, the heart would still be an example of a motor or machine. Okay, I'll go ahead and throw up the next one. The main thing that you would not find are the sex parts. Okay, so one thing that's really important to recognize is that if you were to look at a biological organism and find it on the beach, you would actually find a mechanism for its own reproduction, its own ability to propagate. And again, if you were to look over time, look at the DNA, look at how DNA encodes various structures, you can actually find and discover the mechanism for how those things can modify and change over time to make molecular machines. And so, yeah, if this might be new to you, of having a vision of watches having sex, but the point is that doesn't actually happen. So I think that's a very compelling argument. I think that's one thing we need to really point out, is that there's no mechanism for how a watch, in terms of a design machine, would have ability to propagate and have modifications and etc. Well, but that's actually not the main argument that I want to make. Because I think in many ways, when you're trying to reach an audience as an educator, it's very important to find analogies that help explain both this evolutionary process, but then also is a counterexample to the other side's claim. So this idea of irreducible complexity, what I'd like to introduce everyone is to the evolution, quote unquote, of the handgun. And so, again, if you look at the structure in and of itself, you would say, oh, wow, this is a really interesting complex machine. And in fact, if you were to take any component part away from it, like the trigger, the cartridge, all the other moving parts in that, you'd say, wow, that is irreducibly complex. And one thing I want to point out right now is that I am not in any way an expert on guns. And so there are two resources that I draw this analogy from in terms of the facts about guns. And again, if there's anybody out there who really is an expert on the history of guns or the history of clocks, I could change this into a history of clocks. I would love to collaborate to develop this a little bit more specifically and fully. But the point is that even this example of taking something that we look at now as an quote-unquote irreducibly complex machine, these all developed over time into the machines that we see today. And this in many ways parallels the type of evolutionary process that happens in nature. So let's step back in time a little bit. That in terms of the first recorded known use of a firearm, again, not even a handgun, but a general firearm, that was in the 1300s. And by 1380, there are, again, clearly very useful machines, very simplified. Again, the way these worked is you got some gunpowder, you put it in a little bag, or you just exposed it inside the barrel, just a simplified barrel, and then you put in a small ball of lead, and then what you would do is you would light it on fire. And then the explosion of that gunpowder going off in the confined space would cause the bullet to propel. And so again, you'll notice that compared to what we're familiar with as a modern gun, this is very unwieldy. That in fact, these early guns, while they were capable of high-speed projectile movement, one thing you couldn't do is hold it and fire at the same time. These almost always had to be put on a stand while you did all the other manipulations. And let's face it, under what sort of conditions would guns become pretty useless? If it rained. And so in fact, if it's raining, you also needed a second person to hold like an umbrella or some sort of rain trap so you could still fire the gunpowder. But they worked. Again, so compared to what we think of today as a modern handgun, capable of doing something, but clearly not as complicated as what we would have today. And so the links are there. The links are also in the notes that are in the lecture material giver down here. Now again, so one of the developments that came along in the 1400s was the idea of the matchlock. And this was a relatively small modification. But what it did was there was a little swinging arm, a little movable arm that you could basically trigger so that a lighted wick would then come in contact with the gunpowder. So again, in terms of a small and incremental but very useful advance, this meant you could actually hold the gun at the same time you triggered the explosion to fire the bullet. So again, this was a relatively small advance. They still didn't work very well in the rain. You still had powder that you had to pack in there. You still had to pack a bullet in there separately ahead of time. You could only fire one time. But in terms of accuracy and usability, a nice advantage. So that was the matchlock. Now, one of the further principles is the idea of the wheel lock. And this is the idea that this thing can rotate, and you'll notice that the guns are getting smaller. These are actually becoming hand pistols in a way. But that the wheel lock could generate a spark on its own. Okay, so in terms of a molecular advantage, then what you have here is the ability to not have to worry about the rain extinguishing your wick. Okay, so again, you still had to trigger it, but you could hold it in your hand, but you didn't have to worry about having a separate lighted wick. And again, that flint could just go off. And that way it would fire that, and it'd be, again, a much quicker way of getting the bullet fired compared to your finger action. And you'll notice that what this also allowed, and at least was a parallel advance, was making these into the handgun as compared to being the larger rifles. Sorry, I repeated a segment there, but just in terms of the timing, now we're actually at the point where the future United States is being populated. Again, all the stuff we've talked about before is primarily a European occurrence. But now in the 1630s, you actually have a true flintlock. And so again, this is the same idea where the hard strike of the pin nailing, flint hitting steel to create a spark is where this would actually make direct contact with the gunpowder. And so what this meant is you no longer had to have an open set of gunpowder on the pan. And so one of the things that's notable about this level of development is that at certain points, when people develop this, you could very quickly, accurately, and nicely fire a rifle. And so at this point, and this is interesting from the history of it, there basically was not a lot of change for the next 200 years. Okay, so this was something that was in a slow evolutionary phase because there wasn't any sort of particular new technology or new insight into how to design this to be, faster, better in some way. Now, chemistry, again, combining this novel evolution of chemistry where mercuric fulminate is this explosive compound. And so what this meant was you could actually, instead of having the gunpowder be a separate packaging compared to the bullet, you can actually start now making percussion caps. And so this, again, the percussion detonating principle was patented, and this meant that you could basically have this mercuric fulminate where you didn't have to now strike with flint on steel. You basically just created compression, and then that subsequent explosion would propel a bullet. And so again, this in many ways simplified the design, but it also meant that in terms of the next stage of evolution, this is a nice platform where now you've switched over the propelling mechanism, and then that opened up other avenues for developing the other mechanisms of the gun. Okay, so this occurred in the early 1800s. And then for those fans of Westerns, the most popular handgun, the Colt, in 1835, the Colt handgun appeared. And what this now provides is that since you can have the gunpowder, the percussion, the propelling chemistry be a separate mechanism that doesn't require a lot of hand reloading, or just, you could actually have a rotating mechanism that just rotated the next bullet and percussion cap into place. And so that meant it freed up the pistol to have other designs where you could now have a repeating firing mechanism. So again, there are big advantages to this, where now you've created something that, I'm getting some reports that the sound has stopped. Are there people who are still hearing my voice? Okay, so most people still hear me. Okay. All right, I'll pause for just a second. Okay, cool. Now again, I'm not an engineer or an expert on the handgun, but my presumption, the way I would deduce this, is that now that you've created a mechanism where you don't have to be able to access the firing mechanism, that it allowed you to engineer other parts of the gun to be more efficient. So again, is this a major dramatic change in what we saw before? No, but through persistent, slow refinements, you now have one of the most popular and accurate guns. Again, good enough that when people would have duels, the likelihood of killing each other went up dramatically compared to the old style. In the old days, having a duel, you were lucky if you managed to kill the other person with one shot. So again, with this development of percussion caps and bullets, We get to the mid-1800s, we now start talking about the true pinfire cartridges. So again, where you have a small strike space on a bullet, and then the percussion allows it to propel forward. So again, this would also, one thing I wish I had were comparisons of the way bullets were made. I don't have any images of bullets from this time, but I think that would be something to talk about, the coevolution both of the gun and the way the bullets were machined. And so again, one thing that this points out, though, that I really found interesting about this is that the Crimean War, which is 1850s, there were people who were still using muzzle-loaded guns. And so one evolutionary principle to point out here is that just because a new evolutionary step has occurred, the handgun, pinfire cartridges, bullets with the mercurial fumarate, that doesn't mean the other ones automatically disappeared right away. And so again, over time, there is an overall selection process and supply and demand cycle where only over a certain period of time do the new ones replace the old ones. And in fact, if there are reasons for still using the old technology, if there's some separation between those marketplaces or some use for it that's still novel and unique, you don't necessarily get rid of the old technology. So again, with the evolution of repeating handguns, or also the idea of cartridges. So rifles allow you to, again, instead of using a revolving mechanism, you have a cartridge mechanism that can feed multiple bullets into the machine. Again, I'm not much of an expert on guns, but the next part was this breech-loaded guns, where again, you pull that mechanism out, and that helps load the next bullet into place. But this essentially, the Winchester rifle is produced in the 1873. So again, you'll notice this is something that has very good firing power, a slight modification to the handgun, where you have an extended barrel, which is better for accuracy. But again, one thing to keep in mind is that just because the Winchester rifle is suddenly very useful, you can't carry it everywhere. So this is a point at which I think it's important to say that there's a crosstalk of technologies for handguns and rifles, but ultimately we're looking at now a divergence of characters because you can't carry a rifle very easily. So again, if you wanted to, again, have a lot of firepower that you can carry, there's a compromise involved. Again, handguns would not be able to carry as many bullets, but you would be able to carry them into smaller spaces. And so this is one of these ideas of a divergence point of view, like you see in evolution, where you can have two similar species, but because they differentiate what they do, you can have both working in both progressing and existing in parallel. So in 1887, this repeating technology came into place. The sources I used didn't give a very specific mechanistic description of that. But in essence, in 1892, you finally come across what's called the modern handgun, where essentially you have all the key pieces of this. You have cartridges, you have the ability to hold the trigger once and have multiple bullets fired from it. And this is essentially what we saw in terms of the final design of what we would now call an irreducibly complex modern handgun. Now again, you'll notice that there's still refinement of the different types of guns over time. We have a modest refinement of the tooling mechanism. We have a variety of bullet sizes. Again, there are guns that you can carry in your sock that are easy to conceal versus guns that have an increasing firepower, etc. But over time, this is still just a minor amount of refinement to now, again, the modern Walther PPK, or sorry, Walther P99. So again, my main point in the line of logic here is that while we can look at something we have ourselves designed and we know it's designed because we made it and we have a history of it, by looking at a handgun right now and you say, oh, this is an irreducibly complex machine, you couldn't take any part away from it, well, that's not true. I mean, for that particular gun, that's true, but in terms of the evolution of the handgun getting to that point, there clearly was a working type of firearm that did not have the vast majority of the parts that you see in the modern handgun. And so I think this makes a nice analogy to, one, how evolution works. If you think about any given species, you'll see how there's refinement, there are modifications, there's opportunities for new evolution. And sometimes it happens very quickly. You can have a major leap in modification. Sometimes there's a little bit of a stagnant phase where things don't change very much. But ultimately, this idea of irreducible complexity hinges upon the idea that not only do you have a device, but it has to work exactly the way you're saying in a modern context. And that's also just not true, as I hope is illustrated in this example. So that's the first half of my talk. If there are any questions, or if people have examples in the animal kingdom of things that they think are interesting, now would be a good time to jump on the keyboard or to ask something in local chat that I can actually now go back to.
Well, I would like to add that if a step is too unlikely, it could have said to be too unlikely. If you can identify from one step to another is too unlikely to happen, there is no explanation for it to happen. There is no evidence for it could happen by chance or by any process. And there are times when science cannot know or find them because they are not discovered. And it is true that intelligent design or that kind of examination is true because there are things that cannot be identified because the steps from one to the next is too unlikely. I mean, so unlikely that it is impossible.
So how do you assign a likelihood to whether something did or did not happen from historical evolution? How do you assign that probability?
We have statistics, and we are able to calculate with proteins. Let's say we have something consistent of 100 proteins in a series. What's the likelihood that this exact sequence appears by chance and it is replicated? And if you calculate it with the numbers, you find very large numbers showing that it is highly unlikely to happen. And yet, this is what you have to account for to explain how new things appear.
So, one, I don't think that anybody has constructed a probabilistic map of how proteins should or should not evolve. And I think also when you look at a lot of those arguments, they take a very point mutation perspective on how mutation and evolution and mutation and selection has to occur. And that's an absolutely limited, that is the most limited fashion and way of looking at the way evolution actually occurs. And so, but again, the larger construct of your argument comes down to the idea of the God of the gaps. And this is a standard argument that is saying that, well, okay, well, we can't explain everything in biology, but when we have something we can't explain, then it must have been designed, or a designer or a creator must have somehow decided to intervene at some intermediate step to make some other part occur. And again, that's just refuting the idea of science that if we have two ends, then we know there's a middle part. And so there's very little basis and very little ability to predict how a designer would do something in that way. And I just don't, and the math doesn't make sense. I mean, sorry, I should say, the way you describe the math of saying, oh, we're going to set up a probabilistic construct and say, well, this can't be met, those typically are done in a very limited point mutation fashion, and they don't provide any basis where it's actually just proven other mechanisms to create change over time. So, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, I think this is one thing I want to say that about Michael Behe, and I think it's a positive influence on, yeah, let me just finish my point that he had a very positive influence on getting people to say, let's find these intermediate steps and stages that explain the evolution of very complex parts. And so, again, the large argument that people come back to and discover is that we know there are homologous sequences to these, and we know that there are evolutionary mechanisms that can provide the ability to make those types of things. Adrian, go ahead.
Yeah, you know what? I love the fact that you said it's changed over time. And as a matter of fact, in my years as a a high school teacher a long time ago, when I was a high school teacher. Well, actually, I still am. I'm kind of back and forth between high school and university. But, you know, when we talked about, in quotes, evolution, we did call it change over time. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, I would probably bring in something like fashion or something different. I would like to know why you chose guns, the evolution of the handgun, to compare that to the evolution of anything else.
So why did I pick the handgun? I think as I was putting my class together, I wanted to find a good history of clocks, but I couldn't find a nice condensed version that I could understand very nicely. And I think when I found this PBS show and this other resource for this, it just ends up being a very useful one. Because again, I think the other thing too that appeals to the audience that you're targeting is most everybody understands the basic mechanisms of how guns work. And so if you want to have a starting place of where people can have something to relate to, and then have a basic understanding of the mechanism, and then you give them a little bit of the history, I think that is a useful analogy. That actually is better than clocks, because I have a basic understanding of how clocks work, but not a very specific one. The other thing I also like about the gun analogy, is that it brings in a little bit of chemistry. Again, the idea that a sudden leap in how the evolution occurred because of discovering mercurial fumarates, and probably, again, there are other compounds that people use now that's much more powerful. But I think that's one of those nice examples.
Okay, but a good answer, and I will tell you this. You know, you came on saying I'm a biology professor, and I know you must be doing research in biology. And I just thought, wow, this man wants to talk about handguns to give us some kind of example about the evolution of handguns. And what do you think? What do you think about the difference between even the muzzle distance or the muzzle load? Or, you know, you talked about spark. Honestly, I'm thinking about the physics background or the physics aspect of it, and you know, how long the muzzle is determines how accurate it is. And where did that come in? But you know what? Don't answer that. Never mind. I'm sorry.
Yeah, let me just say, in terms of the physics, the main idea that I think is nice about guns, and I think this is different than fashion in a certain way, is that the modern experience of where guns are and the different types of guns that now exist, that all those, in a sense, are very much like the branching trees of evolution as well. And so they have their own ecological, or again, use niches, where again, the handgun is a very different thing than a rifle, but they are related and they use similar mechanisms. So
exactly.
Okay, yeah, so let me move on. I think those are good questions, and we can revisit more about analogies to evolutionary and biological processes. I did have one question in the local chat, which is Behe still given much credibility, particular after the, again, you're talking about the Fitzmiller versus Dover Board of Education in Pennsylvania, where he was a witness, and really got, from a legal standpoint, got destroyed. And if you look at that decision, there's a nice documentary that Nova did on that case. I don't know much about Behe's credibility in terms of biochemistry, but I think a lot of people still cite him because it's useful that he had this line of argument that makes sense, is easy to understand, although I would say in many ways is still fatally flawed. But for those people in the evolutionary debate, you can believe him if you want, but most true evolutionary biologists dismiss his arguments as, again, one, both not science, and it's also refutable along many lines of rhetoric. All right, so this is the other more novel point of conversation and debate that I wanted to bring up, which is this idea of a biological basis for morality. And what I'm going to throw into local chat really quick is this YouTube video that kind of poses the question that when you start talking about evolution, the creation of humans in the absence of a designer, people get in a bit of a hair hackle-raising situation. So I'm going to throw this in here. And we're only going to watch about 2 minutes. Okay, I'm stopping my viewing of it. Once you finish hearing Christopher Hitchens, well, I'm going to wait just another minute. Hopefully I'm not talking over you too much. And then give a minute to watch that. Then I'm going to resume. Okay, so again, sorry if I just wanted to do an outside media to set up some of the current conversations, because I feel like while I think Hitchens and Dawkins and Sam Harris all do a really brilliant job of refuting certain arguments that, for example, in Hitchens' last part, he appeals to the idea, to the rhetorical argument that helping and being good to other people is just something innate, and that we should just believe in that and go forward. Sam Harris, who I think must be later in that video, has an argument where he says, well, we should just not be bad to people, that we should not create harm and distress in people. And I feel like, personally, those are relatively good arguments, but I think that you'd really want to offer an alternative view based on a rational process to replace this idea that you need morality. That I think we all inherently want to have morality. We want to have a basis for conversations and basis for governments and politics and laws. But the absence of a pre-made moral system like religion, how do you come up with such a thing? So the rest of my argument, this is a very new argument that I'm trying to construct. I don't have a lot of fancy graphics. It's going to be my talking through a line of reasoning. So hopefully this will be convincing for you and I can develop it more later. But let's just start with talking about what a moral is. And this is the idea of right or wrong in human behavior, what most people would be considered a good or bad thing to do, agreeing with a standard of right behavior. And so, again, like in any rhetorical argument, there is one thing you have to grant me, one basic idea, that the survival of the human race is of tantamount importance. And I think there are multiple ways of saying this, is that we like being alive as a species. Our biological purpose would be to be alive. In a self-referential point of view, how could we have this conversation if we didn't exist? And so what I'm going to put forth is a line of argument that says, look, we can use what we understand about biology that relates to the survival of the human race in a way that can be an underpinning for what we, I think, do feel is a basis for moral behavior. And again, I'm also going to make the point that while Darwinian selection typically describes the survival of a few individuals, if you've seen the movie 2012 or you've seen any other sort of doomsday movies where there's a conspiracy going on, they always try and save a select view of like the best people, and I want to make the argument that's also a bad idea. Okay, so the first thing is to remind you a little bit about the process of Darwinian evolution, which is that it's called and we have an inherited commonality with some diversity. And this is true in every species in nature, that diversity can come from recombining different sets of chromosomes, like we do when, like with sperm and egg coming together, we get combinations of chromosomes. There can be spontaneous mutations. Sometimes you have lateral transfer from one species to another of DNA. But when you make progeny, the vast majority of the genetics of your progeny are basically making the same organism that you are. So we are all very closely related to our parents. We are very similar in many ways, but we do have lots of differences. And that the second part of Darwinian evolution is the idea that there are always a few select individuals who outcompete others, not in terms of fighting, not in terms of intelligence, but just in terms of accumulated over time, they have more children than other people, more progeny over time. And so one really good example is Genghis Khan, or some close relative of his, where 1 in 7 males in Mongolia can trace the descent of their Y chromosome back to who was most likely Genghis Khan from several centuries ago. But they've also changed and varied over time. So when we think about how this diversity is important for helping species survive, and I'm picking some examples here just very specific to humans, and these are things that you've probably heard before or are familiar with, is that if you've heard about bubonic plague or HIV, we have molecularly looked at individuals of European descent. We've found individuals who are highly resistant to HIV, and we've discovered that there are mutations in 2 genes called CXCR4 and CCR5. So again, if you were to imagine that if bubonic plague or HIV were to become a worldwide event, somehow it transmitted to everyone and affected and killed the vast majority of people on the planet, because there are a few individuals who had spontaneous mutations in these genes, the human race would survive. And that's exactly what you saw in Europe, is that the first wave of bubonic plague killed 2/3, and then subsequent invasions of the plague killed fewer and fewer people, and you saw an increase in the frequency of these genes, and you see that in Europe, say, compared to other parts of the world. Cholera is another disease where you get dehydrated and die from the Vibrio cholera organism. And I actually have a typo in here. This should be CFTR. But basically, there's this chloride receptor that when mutated doesn't work as well, and so you don't dehydrate as quickly. And so if you have a good copy of the CFTR gene and a bad copy, you actually resist cholera better. And this is something that you see in a higher frequency in people where cholera was an endemic disease and people died. Malaria is the classic textbook example where malaria kills you, spread by mosquitoes caused by a plasmodium. But there are sickle cell anemia as well as beta thalassemias. When you have mutations in your hemoglobin, as long as you have one working copy of those proteins, you actually survive malaria at a higher rate. And so you see a much higher prevalence of sickle cell traits, again, the allele for it, in African populations than you do in other populations in the world where there's not a lot of malaria. 2 other good examples, again, when you have high intensity UV light and you've suddenly evolved in a way that you shed your fur, well, now your skin is very susceptible to getting damage, getting cancer, and also getting sunburned, which is just uncomfortable. So an increased production of melatonin in order to make a darker skin pigmentation became a selective advantage. Then also, but once humans started to migrate out of Africa, where there was much less UV light, you subsequently discovered that they weren't making enough vitamin D, because the way we make vitamin D is one of the intermediate steps of naturally making vitamin D is UV radiation at the skin level. And I'm just realizing I put in melatonin, the term is actually melanin. That's actually the pigment is melanin, not melatonin. Melanin. But so one reason why we have a lighter skinned group of people in climates away from the equator is because those people died when they had darker skin. Yeah, so vitamin D supplementation is a big topic these days if you enjoy milk. Now, but again, speaking of milk, one thing that we naturally did not do way back when, and most mammals don't do, is to drink milk in their adult phases. So again, being a mammal means we're raised early on by getting breast milk. But we don't need it anymore after that. In fact, it can actually be rather uncomfortable to have milk as an adult. Well, there are certain groups that have popped up, and this includes Caucasians, where we actually keep the expression levels of lactase, the enzyme that degrades lactose, and we can then capture more energy from it. So by having a random mutation that provided the advantage of drinking more milk, which has lots of nutrition, not just the sugar, but lots of nutritive effects, we actually increased in the frequency in the population. So again, I hope these are nice, familiar examples to you. If you have any questions, let me know. But again, these are examples of spontaneous mutations that in certain environmental conditions are very advantageous to have. And so these increase in frequencies in the population. Another example that's not as well known is the idea of the major histocompatibility complex system. And this is a complicated immunology topic. The basic lesson from it is that the more diverse your genes are, the more robust of an immune system you have. And of course, the more robust of an immune system you have, the more likely you are to live longer, live healthier, and to have progeny. And this also includes the ability to fight off cancer. Again, one interesting and parallel story here is that the idea of pheromones and body smell is something that allows us to subconsciously detect people whose diversity is different than ours. And that way, when we have children, the diversity is going to be even higher among our children when we can mate with someone who has a high diversity. So if you've ever heard about this phenomenon of people having sweaty t-shirt smelling parties or matchmaking events, this is the idea that if you think another person's sweat smells nice, and this primarily pertains to females, not so much to males, but if you think a male smells nice, especially during the fertile period of your menstrual cycle, then that's an indication that there's actually a better chance of having more surviving progeny from that. And I think this also is aligned with the idea that, again, there's this idea of finding exotic people attractive, and that is that we know they are. Again, Starr asked the question, this is related to this, is that there is a certain amount of sexual attraction that is encoded in us that's heightened when someone's more different than us. And now again, the ability to understand those mechanisms comes from our sense of smell and a little bit from our sense of sight. And so the idea of an exotic mate, which again, exotic I'm using in the term to mean a very distinct genetic heritage. So if you're someone who is Caucasian, you've been in, say, the upper parts of Europe for the last 100 years, that's where your genetics have been, and then you find someone from an equatorial South America, you find them very different and potentially interesting. And then again, the genes in your progeny and your major histocompatibility complex will be more diverse as well, thus potentially more successful children. So the logical conclusion that I hope comes out of this and makes sense is that enhancing and helping the most people to survive promotes having the more diverse genetics in the human population, which leads to a higher chance of survival for the human race if there's some future selective challenge or selective pressure. And so again, when one thinks about taking this as a basic template of something that just makes a lot of biological sense to do, then in terms of promoting aid and development to poor communities, promoting dignity and the human rights for everyone, promoting peace and elimination of conflicts and thus unnecessary early deaths, and the ability to raise children successfully, and the right to choose one's mate in terms of letting them find what they find biologically attractive among other traits, is something that these are all things that one would conclude one should do as a type of behavior. I think if you look at these align with much softer definitions of what is or is not moral behavior, things that, as Christopher Hitchens would say, we innately feel is a moral way to behave on the planet. Now again, any given and relatively young idea can potentially be overinterpreted. And again, if you are a fan of science fiction or other more historical writings, the idea that we should promote certain biology over others or diversity can be overinterpreted in certain ways. Like, well, how about if we're saying we need more genetic diversity for making children, then maybe we should not provide rights to people who don't mate. Again, people who maybe are infertile for some biological reason or are homosexual or postmenopausal women. I think that, again, my refutation to this is that there's been lots of data now shown that these people aid in the survival of other individuals. And I'm only going to give one example right now, that when we think about, there was a data published looking at the Canadian census, where if you have children that are within the same locality as their grandparents. So again, this is a limited amount of data you can get from the census: location, age of death. But it showed that those people had a higher survival rate. So grandparents contribute to the survival of subsequent generations. And there's actually some interesting quantitative data when it comes to the nieces and nephews of homosexual, say, aunts and uncles, that if they're not producing progeny themselves, then they actually can aid and promote a higher survival rate for the children of their brothers and sisters with whom they share a lot of genetics. And so, again, there are counter-arguments to all these. I think it would be premature to say, oh, we should only extend morality to people who are capable of reproducing. The other idea, too, is that maybe we should engineer more diversity or engineer out bad genes. And I think that that's a bad idea. I think at our current state of knowledge of what is or is not a good gene, because let's face it, those examples I gave before of cholera, as well as bubonic plague, CFTR gene, as well as CXCR5, those are things that are defective. And so from a very logical point of view, we would start taking out defective genes if we tried to do some sort of eugenics, and that would actually be counterproductive if there was something where defects in those genes were actually helpful for our survival. Does anybody have any other offhand counter arguments to this? Let me make one final concluding remark, and then if there's something else you can think of that is a way of taking the logic I've presented already and turning it into a bad idea, then please throw that up on the keyboard. And so this is my final closing thoughts, but again, the final idea here would be that you should be nice and respect everyone, because his or her genes may be our species' salvation. And with that, I am done with my talk. And so we'll go by the cue board. If you have questions about the technology, the line of arguments from biology, let me know. But if you have any flaws in the argument, I would love to hear those too. All right, thanks everyone for coming. If you're going to bug out now before the Q&A part starts. But thanks for coming and thanks for listening. If you want me to give an exam, I certainly could. But there's no plan for it at the moment. Again, I teach a biology class, and I also teach a history of biology class for my honors college, but this type of line of arguments is not on the final.
So there might be some kind of things that you might want to introduce to other people's genetic makeup, like things that you might get from their stem cell that would help them get cured of certain diseases.